I am not the target audience for this movie. This movie is targeted primarily at young men trying to figure out what to do with the rest of their lives, with a secondary target of older men who own businesses. I would love to get back to the place where I own a business. If I do, there are good lessons in this movie to remember and take to heart at that time. I may have my daughter watch this when she gets later in her teen years, but at this point anything that could be relevant will be alien to her. My son, being developmentally delayed, won't get anything out of the movie. This is not the path he's on. For the audience that this movie is targeted at, this is a good movie that I would highly recommend. There are lessons of faith and community in this movie that push back against the loneliness and skepticism of our current generation. Without a doubt, the world will be a better place if more people take the lessons in this movie to heart. That said, I'm almost the poster child for the problems being in the wrong audience can cause when watching a movie like this. Part of the story is that the employees pull together and work an extra night shift when their boss needs them. This can be read as a kind of loyalty to their employer. In my own personal experience, the call to loyalty to an employer has been used to criticize me and isolate me at times when I was already feeling attacked and isolated. Almost 19 years ago, my oldest son was born. He was born early. He had difficulty breathing and eating. There were abnormal echoes when listening to his heart. Although we didn't know it at the time, he had genetic abnormalities. When I went into HR 19 years ago to tell them that my wife was going to have a baby after 5 years of exemplary service, the immediate response was, "I don't see how that's my problem." When I said that I wanted to take time off, I was asked to reconsider. When my son's troubles turned out to be more extreme than initially thought and my parents offered to support my wife and I for a month longer than we had initially scheduled and budgeted to take off, my supervisor insisted that I consider how inconvenient this would be for the company. So, among other things that I did while I was on paternity leave, I started the process of looking for other work. It was a recession at that time. It took me 2 years to find another job. I moved from technical support to working at a paper mill for 12-hour shifts per week, which could be extended to 16 hours if the relief called in sick. Not long before changing jobs, my son started having seizures. We did what we could, but it was hard for my wife to be at the hospital alone while I was at work. When I had been there a few months, the seizures started happening more frequently. My relief wasn't coming in on a particular night that my son had been taken into the hospital after a seizure. I told my machine tender that I couldn't stay, that my son was in the hospital, and I left anyway. Something very similar happened a little less than 2 weeks later. The machine tender and the manager each had a talk with me, trying to impress upon me how important it is that I start to reconsider my priorities. They wanted to make sure I was aware how inconvenient this all was. Believe me, there are vanishingly few people more aware of how inconvenient my son's seizures are than I am. Things at church weren't much better. When I explained at church that I was under pressure at work for leaving at my scheduled leave time whenever my son was in the hospital, I was met with, "Well, you need to consider it from their point of view. After all, your son is in the hospital quite a bit, and if you really stop your life every time he goes in the hospital, you're not going to have a job very long." There were people that were willing to bring pre-made dinner for my wife, or give us a quilted blanket, or cover a month of our water bill when the medical bills got high, but it was clear that I was expected to remain isolated from my family, and my allegiance was expected to be to my job. I was laid off from the paper mill about 6 months before my second son was convinced. I used the money and some of the unemployment to open a kung fu school, working odd jobs in the summer, and on the side to keep bills paid. My second son was also born early and small, and with a lot of difficulties, and ultimately died 5 months later. That took a lot of my focus away from the kung fu school, and from my job searching during that 5 months. My unemployment counselor was very disgusted with me. When my son was finally declared terminal, a different counselor was able to secure me a month reprieve from job searching. That was enough time to see my son off to the next world, tuck him into the earth for the last time, and get my personal affairs in order. Then I hit the job search hard. I recognized that I was too depressed and disoriented to run the Kung Fu school full-time. I continued to run it part-time for a few years, but in addition to other work. My unemployment counselor commented what a transformation it was after that month off. She asked me what changed. I told her, I'm not leaving every job interview to run to the hospital and watch my son die. That's what changed. Apparently, if you can't just put all that out of your head, you're not suited to receive unemployment according to some unemployment counselors. I'm 45 years old now. In between then and now, I worked at a fishing rod factory called G. Loomis. I started working there a month after my rainbow baby was born. G. Loomis was a smaller shop, and their attitude towards me and my family situation was very different. They didn't pay well, but on the December that my family was deciding to put our money into paying off the last of the medical bills we had accumulated through my oldest son's life, G. Loomis gave us a $200 gift card. We went from just getting the kids' cards so that we could afford to get through the month to being able to actually buy presents for our kids and friends. I had a few times when I had to take calls while working related to my son's health, and they were always understanding and helpful. I wish that I had more experiences like that from when I was younger. That I've had a dozen jobs and only had that experience once is telling, though. It's similarly telling that G. Loomis was, far beyond any other job I've ever had, the job where I've felt the most pressure to turn away from the Christian faith. I would love to see the church take a harder stand on inconsiderate employers. I can tell you firsthand what the church does when someone has to choose their family over their job, and it's not pretty. I've attended a lot of churches, and the only advice I can give to people who are in my situation is to look for the churches that have rainbows on the sign. If those churches that are avoiding rainbows don't like that advice, then you can change the things that drive me to that. I don't care about the rainbow politics. That's not my circus, those aren't my monkeys. But when asking for compassion from an employer is negatively equated with communism by some churches, it's troubling for those of us that have to live through it. If you are in a church tradition that negatively equates compassion and communism, then I would submit that there are atheists in this country that are closer to God than you are. The minor prophets and the Gospels are filled with scathing critiques of rich people that lack compassion. Our current world doesn't lack rich people and doesn't have an abundance of compassion. The television show Undercover Boss is so entertaining exactly because of the CEOs that are learning for the first time that their employees are struggling to make ends meet, and that their employees have lives outside of work. That means that our secular neighbors are willing to call out greed, corruption, and self-centered thinking in our elite. However, it's telling that in the biographical films of Angel Studios and the Kendrick Brothers movies, not one has had the courage to call out corporate corruption and greed in the current generation. I think that's something that I would like to see the current Christian movie complex address more directly and concretely.